The Silence is one of those weird series that fly under a lot of people's radars because of its weak promotion and a few other reasons. And the fact that this is from Netflix does not make it any better. So, what is this story about? In the future, fresh water becomes a relatively rare resource. So, while most of humanity fight over the small quantities of water that is left, groups of fearless astronauts venture into other worlds in order to find resources to improve the lives of countless souls back home. But for some reason, South Korea spends an enormous sum of money to mine the lifeless moon, and one day they find out that everyone who was in the research facility located on the moon has died due to what they assume is a radiation leak. So 5 years later, a group of astronauts are sent to retrieve what they were researching. And our main character, Dr. Song, is also included in this strange odyssey because her sister was the head researcher of the facility on the moon. And thus begins a violent adventure uncovering the eldritch underbelly of our celestial neighbor. I am excited because there's quite a lot to be praised in this amazing story. Because even with a relatively low budget, they managed to create a visually stunning masterpiece surrounded with spine-chilling horrors. The sets and the costumes look amazing, and how the mysterious entity affects our cast of characters is portrayed through wonderful visuals, and the sense of isolation and dread our cast members are forced to confront is shown to the audience through great acting and by the surreal atmosphere created through the haunting music and the gloomy cinematography. The script is tight and consistent for the most part. I will get to that soon. And with those out of the way, let's talk about the problems this show has and a few things this show fails at. The first episode takes quite a while to set the stage for what is to come. So there are a few massive torrents of exposition. Therefore the dialogue is a bit clunky. But if you watch the English dub, it's lifeless and stiff all the way through. So what I'm trying to say is watch with subtitles. And since
I'm something of a scientist myself,
I can't help but wonder how certain people got food and, well, water, considering the scenario they are facing. More on that later. But despite its problems, the show remains remarkably brilliant and entertaining most of the time. But unfortunately, I can't go into detail about some of the stuff without spoiling a few details that are important to the plot. So you have been warned. The story starts with our cast of characters assembling and beginning their voyage. According to the information they are provided, the researchers on the moon all perished because of a radiation leak. Okay, so the researchers who died 5 years ago. This raises the question, why did the SAA wait for 5 years to retrieve their holy grail? Maybe it took them 5 years to build the rocket. Fine, I can let that fly. So another criticism I heard about this series is how inaccurate the moon landing is portrayed. Because regularly rockets are detached from the shuttle as it leaves the atmosphere. This is not an issue because the rockets are normally detached from the shuttle when they run out of fuel. This is done mainly to reduce the mass of the shuttle via controlled explosives because they are useless to the shuttle. But here the shuttle our characters travel does not detach the rockets until they almost reach the moon's atmosphere. Now why isn't this a problem? Because if the rockets can propulse the shuttle further, it could be a waste of resources just to detach it with fuel remaining. Now, why is there fuel remaining after leaving Earth's atmosphere? Well, who knows? This is a science fiction series after all. So perhaps the rocket fuel burns longer, or maybe the rockets can store more fuel. Either way, this isn't a huge problem. Then they crash land on the moon for some reason. It is implied that the rocket was sabotaged, but I'm not sure how. Let's move on for a second. Due to the difference in gravity, everything on Earth weighs 6 times less on the surface of the moon. So some of these things are a bit strange. But again, this isn't a huge problem because almost everyone survives the crash. Then they decide to walk to the moon base. Okay, glad you landed close enough to the moon base. Otherwise the lack of oxygen might have killed you all. Then afterwards they are very careful, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, it's just nice to see people act intelligently in sci-fi horror stories. They are so damn cautious, they are even reluctant to remove their helmets in safe places. Throughout the first 2 episodes barely anything unsettling happens, but the show does an amazing job by hinting at mysteries that will be significant later. On the 3rd episode, our head engineer Soo Chan starts acting strange, and then all of a sudden
얘 얼굴이 왜 이래? 너 어디 아파? 어?
he throws up an incredibly large amount of water until he dies. Then the human fountain turns off. This was definitely a shocking scene, but it does raise a few questions. Okay, so Soo-chan accidentally got infected by a 5-year-old corpse. So was the foreign object still alive inside the corpse for 5 years? It has to be, right? Because it was even alive for so long, frozen in the core of the moon. Okay, let's just keep that in mind. So apparently this foreign object is a water-like compound that endlessly reproduces at a rapid rate, as long as it has a living host. This is where the cosmic horror aspect comes in. Our celestial neighbor, which we gazed upon at night for eons, was hiding something that violates the very laws of nature we have come to understand. This begs the question, is this compound alive? How did the silent ocean, slumber dormant under the moon, come to exist? How did it reproduce on the moon? Because it cannot reproduce without the perfect temperature for it to be active. Is it older than life on Earth? Perhaps it is the purest form of the primordial ooze from which life itself began on Earth. If that is the case, so where did it even come from? Maybe from another planet that was consumed by the silent ocean? Or it could be a failed experiment to create life from a group that is far more intelligent than we are. But one thing is for sure, lunar water is an entity we know frighteningly little about. Just in case you guys aren't convinced that this is cosmic horror, let's compare 3 of the most popular cosmic horror stories with this one. The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, and Shadow over Innsmouth. Now let's look at what these stories have in common. Humanity coming into contact with something they cannot really understand. Something that could potentially lead to the end of the world. You know, kind of like lunar water. And 2 of those stories are about attempts at uncovering an ancient secret older than the human race, kinda like lunar water. But I'm certain some of you are still skeptical, so I will do a separate video comparing almost every Lovecraftian story that deals with cosmic horror elements, so I can get to the bottom of this ocean of madness. Now back to the video. So despite how much I adore this show, it has problems, like the lack of consistency at times created by attempts at escalating the dread and to show the threats are something far more devastating than they actually are. I mean, they really have this thing with, you know, they want to make the stakes really high. I mean, anyway, let's get back to that in a moment. But after Soo-chan's death, the crew is shocked and tries their best to get to the bottom of this, because if this is an infection, then everyone is in danger. And I like how the characters wear hazmat suits when carrying Soo-chan's body, but then we slowly approach another problem. In order to identify what is common between Soo-chan and the victims who died 5 years ago, Dr. Song and Han get blood samples from Soo-chan and a random dead dude in the station. And apparently both of their blood contains a substance extremely similar to water. Then Dr. Song tests out a hypothesis without informing anyone else. So this experiment confused the shit out of me. When Song drops a drop of blood onto a drop of water that was extracted from, the dead bodies, the water, it starts to multiply and share the drop of blood till it is completely invisible to the naked eye. The implication here is that when coming in contact with organic matter, Luna water multiplies. So shouldn't the Luna water just flat out dissolve skin of its victims before it kills them? There's also an implication that Luna water needs to get into someone's bloodstream before it can multiply. So I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and say it can only multiply while in contact with living red blood cells. Fair enough, right? So I'm certain some of you are like, if a drop of blood can make that much water, why isn't the entire moon base just a giant fish tank? Because human bodies are filled with blood. So shouldn't every drop of blood just produce more water till the moon base floods? Here's the thing, something similar to this happens later in the series. A guy gets his arm ripped off and Luna water pours onto the spilled blood. This literally floods the entirety of the station. It's really cool, but does it make sense? Yes, it actually does. So blood cells can remain alive outside of the body for quite a bit, provided the necessary conditions. But when a person dies, the blood cells starts to die within 20 to 30 minutes due to liver mortis. So technically, blood outside the body might have a better chance at surviving with Luna water outside escaping liver mortis. Okay, cool. Let's move on. So after some interesting events, the crew discovers secret layers in part of the restricted areas. And I just love the way this place looks. So this place has so many containers of Luna water. The crew tries to pick a few up and leave, but are attacked by a monster. And turns out this monster is a little girl. After some strange battles, we discover that this girl is not really human. And she can drink Luna water without any adverse side effects. Trust me, the explanation will make even less sense. Then our scientist lady befriends the little monster and she takes her to her little hideout. And this hideout contains all the secret data, secret stuff. So Song watches an exposition tape, and in one of these videos we can see Song's sister putting a cute little fishy into a fish tank without water, and then drops a drop of Luna water onto the fish's gills. The fish fills the entire tank in seconds. Now we run into another problem. So here's the thing. Fish in water bodies don't breathe water. They filter the oxygen in the water through their gills. So what's wrong, you might ask? Here's the thing, Luna water doesn't include oxygen, so that fishy ain't lasting too long. So a fish in a video should be dead even though it is alive. What's the big deal, right? Well, this is where things get weird.
They experimented on children.
No one is saying what they did was right. They experimented on children!
So apparently the monster girl is an artificial human being, a clone whose DNA is altered to be stronger, faster and able to consume Luna water. This is because her body creates antibodies to kill the Luna water and she can also regenerate after drinking it. I'm not sure how that works. I didn't really like this twist due to a few reasons. First,
they experimented on children!
It establishes that cloning technology exists. Secondly, it implies that genetic engineering is possible to this degree. Normally I would be okay with concepts like this as long as they are established earlier. But here this is just introduced out of nowhere, and don't even get me started on Luna water plants. I mean, there's quite a bit of problems like our moon base having oxygen after being abandoned for 5 years, our characters surviving quite a long time without food, and a few other problems. But these errors don't ruin the story entirely. They will most certainly irritate you and frustrate you, but the chance of these details breaking your immersion is rather low.